Hello, welcome to Light from Light. My name is Daniel, and his name is Brother Thomas Therese.
It is. Sorry, I wasn't sure if you wanted me to come in there or not. Just sort of left you hanging.
Welcome to Light from Light. So we're going to talk today about a very important saint who's played a huge role actually in the Christian faith in this country, in England. And his name is Aelred. Did I pronounce that right?
Aelred. Aelred of Rievaulx.
So I've been trying to say this name all day, trying to get it right.
He also thought that
Aelred.
Rievaulx was in France.
Oh yeah, thanks.
Just thought I'd throw you in there. It's not surprising because, Rievaulx, it ends in LX. That sounds French, doesn't it? And actually, the Cistercians were founded in France, of course.
Do you know where do they get the name from? Do they
It's
have
the
some
place.
sort of link to... Does the place have a link to somewhere in France?
Quite possibly. After 1066, of course, when the Normans came over, perhaps it was founded then. Or maybe the place where it was located was named after the abbey. But certainly people in high society used French rather than Saxon. And I think Aelred, actually, his background was in high society. I think his grandfather, was Chancellor of York, and his father was a priest. Yes, yeah. But it's in Yorkshire anyway. Rievaulx. The abbey is now in ruins. Thank you, Henry VIII.
But you can go and visit it now. You can still see the ruins of it. But it's quite expansive, quite an expansive place. Mm-hmm. It would have been anyway. But so this gentleman, Aelred of Rievaulx. Brother Thomas studied French, so he should know the pronunciation much better.
Gosh.
So I didn't know much about him, and I did think he was a Frenchman, or at least that he maybe was born in England and ended up in France. But he was a gentleman that was born in Hexham in Northumbria, and he's a man who had a great love of the north of England. But we wanted to speak about him because he's a man who played a big part in passing the Christian faith on through the generations. In particular, he had a major impact on monastic life for the religious in this country. So yeah, he's not a gentleman that I'd ever heard about, but he is someone who played who had an important part to play in the faith of this country. And his feast day is coming up very soon. So
yeah, January the 12th. I always feel really sorry for him that he's not more well known. You'll never find statues really made of him or stained glass windows of him, really. I think it's such a shame because he wrote, spiritual classics. The two things that he wrote which are most well known are The Mirror of Charity, which... That's not my favourite one, I've got to admit. It's got some really good stuff in there, obviously. But the one that I really love is On Spiritual Friendship, which is probably what he's most well known for, I'd say. But he also did some other things, didn't he?
Well, I suppose we'll come back to the spiritual works of his, but he was most well known, certainly in the years after his death, maybe for the first century after his death, for his historical works. So he wrote about the history of Christianity in this country and some of the major figures, major Christian figures who helped pass on the faith in this country. And he was most well known for that for the first maybe 100 years after his death. And then from that point onwards, people started to rediscover almost his spiritual works. So Mirror of Charity was something that he wrote when he was a new abbot of a community. So he was the new head of a community of religious. And I think actually he was a novice master. So he was in charge of helping to form new religious brothers. So he had great insights into that way of life. And then spiritual friendship is something which is a work which was formed a little bit later in his life. But just to go back then to his early life, so he was the son of a priest. So how does that work? Because our experience here in this country and in most of the church is that priests are celibate. Mm-hmm. So how did this priest? We're talking the 1100s, the 12th century. How did a priest have a child?
Well, in the early church, Peter, for example, was married. The first pope was married. So it's not something about the clerical state that's sort of intrinsic to its nature, that it means that you can't be married and that you can't have children, right? So it's a discipline of the church, and this is something that the early church in the first 1,000 years sort of grappled with, and the church adopted this discipline, but it wasn't really enforceable. And I mean, it was sporadic in its enforcement. You know, popes would have to keep reminding people about the discipline of celibacy. And I think it's really in the wake of the Council of Trent, around the time of the Reformation, that you get more uniform sort of discipline, I think, on these things. And you have various waves throughout the church, various reforms which attempt to reform the morals of the clergy, which didn't only focus on chastity or celibacy, but that was certainly part of it. And certainly, I think in actually just before Aelred was born, I think there was a synod or a council or something in France, which basically ruled that the sons of clergy could not be ordained to the priesthood. And partly that was so that they wouldn't, what we would say is inherit the benefice, or that they wouldn't inherit the parish church, right? So say at your local parish down the road, you have Father Joe. Father Joe has a son called Isaac. Well, Isaac then gets ordained and then becomes the priest of the same parish, and then his son becomes priest of the same parish. So it becomes like a family business, right?
Right.
So like nepotism. And to curb anything like that, then there is this synod which introduces a discipline that actually the son of any clergy member cannot be ordained to the priesthood, to prevent that sort of nepotism whereby one parish with its benefice, with its revenue, just comes in to fund the family. So whilst you may have this discipline within the church very early on, it's not universally enforced, I would say. So that's basically how it happens, I think.
I suppose through being a priest at that time, his father would have been someone who mixed with people of more stature, people of greater stature at the time. I mean, certainly Aelred was...
He's very well educated.
I was going to say, he's very well educated, and he was very, very clever.
Yeah.
So early on in his life, he ended up going to one of the best places to study, wasn't it? Durham Priory, a school there where he studied to a very high level, and he was very gifted. People recognized him as being very gifted. And he then went into the service of the court for King David of Scotland at that time, and he flourished as a courtier, I guess it would be called. And he was very well known for his diplomatic skill. So he ended up being what's called a master of the household. So he would be
for King David the First, was that? Yeah.
So King David would confide in him about things that were going on in his kingdom, and he'd really be like a diplomatic ear. And this formation would play a very important role as he became abbot. So he was part of the church's mission for diplomatic missions. Wasn't he sent to Rome on one occasion?
Yeah, I mean, the bishops of Northumbria sent him as their representative to canonical proceedings in Rome. I think Henry II, I think it was, introduced the Bishop of York, and the bishops in the northeast of England weren't too happy about the person who Henry favoured for the bishopric. So how it sort of worked then as now is the Pope takes advice and information from people on the ground. So now it would be like a papal nuncio, like the Pope's ambassador in a particular area, and he asks him to scout around, and he will talk to local bishops about their own priests, about who would make a good bishop and things like that, who lives a good life, do they pray and things. Well, at the time, they would also... at the time of Aelred, they would talk to the king, and they'd talk to other bishops and things. Well, the bishops of Northumbria weren't happy with who was going to be Archbishop of York, and Rome has jurisdiction in these matters, and so they went to Rome, and there was a canonical trial where Aelred, it went on for a long time, maybe even
But
years.
Aelred was sent.
Aelred was sent to represent them to the Pope, I think, who was Innocent II at the time, I think.
Right. Okay. So he was very well known for his diplomacy, but obviously that
and his learning.
From,
I mean, he read Cicero, the classics, or the Christian classics like Saint Augustine. So yeah, he was a man who was very well educated and respected politically as well, for his work in the courts.
Actually, it just reminded me of something. So he probably read some of the Greek philosophers where they talk very much about the dialogue. So Plato's work is very much about dialogues, and some of his spiritual works are called the dialogue of the soul. So you have this sort of dialogue, even in his work, Spiritual Friendship. You see this dialogue that goes on in there between two monks and Christ. So there is.
I think that actually follows the dialogue method. I think actually follows Cicero.
Right.
I don't know if he had access to Plato. I don't think he would have had access to Aristotle. I think Aristotle starts to come in around the time of Aquinas, maybe slightly before him.
Maybe a century after Aelred.
A century after Aelred. But Plato, I think, was certainly Plato would have been part of the curriculum, certainly before Aquinas, absolutely. And that's one of the reasons why Aristotle is so controversial, of course.
Yeah, maybe that had an influence. I'm not sure. But it's quite astonishing that he leaves this very comfortable life in the court, a great promise of a comfortable life in the future, and he leaves that to join a Cistercian monastery in Yorkshire. And if anyone knows anything about the Cistercian life, it's quite rigorous.
Austere.
It's
austere.
So he moves from having great comfort to a life which is very much about prayer, about detachment from material things, about spending time in poverty, if you like.
And silence. Great silence, great liturgy.
Very different. But he writes beautifully about it. In his work, The Mirror of Charities, I mean, he doesn't shy away from saying how difficult the life is. He displays that very much in that book. But he writes beautifully, everywhere peace, everywhere serenity, and a marvelous freedom from the tumult of the world. So even at that time, it was tumultuous in the world. But he found peace and serenity, even through great hardships that he experienced in the religious life. So, yeah, I mean, as a religious brother, as someone who...
I can sympathize.
But as someone who has a sort of a life which has an affinity to this monastic rule. So as a Dominican friar, you have some things which are very similar, that life of prayer, the times of silence, no possessions. I mean, don't own anything personally. The order owns things. But there are similarities there. Have you found that it frees you? I mean, Aelred speaks about that, being freed to delve into the relationship that he has with God.
Yeah, I mean, it can do. I think it depends on the individual friar. I mean, sometimes it frees you and liberates you, and you sort of give things. Like, I notice this actually with things like books. I'll get some books, I'll read them, and I might give them to friends for Christmas and things. So yeah, I mean, it can be quite liberating and encourage you to be quite generous. Although obviously you have to be careful, because I mean, things don't belong to you. Anything that you have, it actually belongs to the order and things. So providing the library doesn't want them, that brothers don't want them and things, and you get permission that you can give, then you can give things away. Yeah, also like moving house, when you move from the priory to another priory, a lot of things actually you leave behind. You don't take any furniture with you from your room. You might have a really nice comfy chair in your room. You don't get to take that with you. So but that can also cause, I mean, I think people respond to it in different ways. It can be, it can take time to cultivate the virtue of detachment from physical things to focus on that which matters much more, and it's easier said than done, I think.
I mean, it's clearly not easy to do.
Yeah.
I mean, you think now the average person probably owns more. Certainly in England, probably owns more now than in centuries gone by.
And there are some things, for example, that I don't share with other people. So my laptop, for example, whilst yes, technically it is the responsibility of the community, it's something that essentially I'm going to use. And if somebody else sort of needs it for a PowerPoint or something, or to show a film on a big screen or something, then of course they can use the laptop. But as most of the time, like 90% of the time, it's just going to be you that uses this thing, or my phone, for example. But it does mean that, if a brother does need it, you should be very free and willing to say, "Oh, absolutely," and not think twice about it. Yeah,
interesting. So his life, Aelred's life, then, as he joins the monastery initially, he has a huge impact on his brothers. So he ends up being the abbot of a daughter house of the abbey there in, how do you say,
Rievaulx.
So he ends up being the abbot of a daughter house, a new house that opens, a Cistercian house, and he ends up leading that community. And then he comes back to
Rievaulx,
and he ends up being abbot there, and he's much loved. I mean, in what's known about his life is that he has great compassion. He's a father figure for the other brothers who are there, and they speak with great reverence for him and his role as abbot. He speaks wonderfully about this role in his work, Mirror Charity. So he says, "As I was walking around the cloister of the monastery, the brethren were sitting around forming, as it were, a most loving crown. I found no one whom I did not love, and no one by whom I felt sure I was not loved. I felt such joy that it surpassed all the delights of the world." So here's a man who earlier in his life had every material good that he could possibly have at that time. And yet he found delights that surpassed all of that. Yet he didn't own anything himself. I mean, it's astonishing what a transformation that he had at the monastery.
Yeah, I mean, there must be some sort of conversion that takes place that leads him into this place. Really, I think he comes to this. How do I want to phrase it? I think he sees a lot of emptiness actually in what he considers to be worldly treasures, work for treasure in heaven, we read in the gospel, not treasure that will rust and decay. You can't take, your gold pieces and your fine clothes with you to heaven, and I think he comes to realize what that means. And this leads him on this austere path to prefer nothing to God.
But it's not an isolated life. So one of the things I know about your life as a religious brother is that you have brothers who are your friends.
Yeah.
You're not, as Christians, we're not meant to live this path on our own. We're not meant to journey to heaven on our own as like isolated figures.
Yeah.
We're meant to live with other people and with friends. And that's something which Aelred makes very, very clear, especially in his work on spiritual friendship.
Yeah. I think people think, when in Genesis it says man was not made to dwell alone, they automatically think, Adam and Eve, marital relationships, romantic relationships, sexual relationships, and so this becomes the pinnacle and the ideal of love. But actually, that man was not meant to dwell alone does not necessarily entail that marital, romantic, sexual relationship. Actually, friendship is also a way of not dwelling alone. That is also a life of intimate love with other people. Well, it's not sexual, but it's love.
Well, what does Christ say about friendship?
You read in the Gospel of John, no greater love has a man than this, that he should die for his friends. So that self-sacrificial love for one's friends is the greatest form of love as espoused by the Gospel of John. He also says at the Last Supper, I call you no longer servants, I call you friends. And then he says, love one another as I have loved you. Now, of course, in the Gospel of John, Jesus is presented as the bridegroom. You do find in the book of Revelation, happy are those who are called to the marriage supper of the Lamb.
In the Old
But the
Testament,
people who
you
are
have
called
Song
to a
of
marriage
Songs.
supper are not only the bride and the groom, but also all the guests of the
all your
bride and the
friends.
groom, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, love one another as I have loved you has, and then he calls them no longer servants but friends. It's been taken as friendship, really, an intimate, profound friendship which has a sort of new life, and you do see this in Aelred's writings, especially on spiritual friendship.
And he's heavily influenced by Cicero. So
Yes,
Cicero has a work on friendship. I don't know much about it.
it's just called On Friendship. And then Aelred writes something, and it's also in the form of a dialogue. And then you have Aelred writes on spiritual friendship. So he brings Christ into this friendship because he talks about different types of friendships.
Yeah, so he speaks about 3 different types, doesn't he? 3 different types of friendship. You were telling me earlier about how, was it reason?
Friends for a reason,
That's it.
friends for a season, and friends for life. Aelred talks about carnal friendships, or friendships that are based on bodily pleasure. So, two people, are very attracted to each other. They have a sexual relationship, not necessarily within the bounds of marriage. You would say this is a carnal relationship, one primarily of physical attraction, which can decay.
Or you might have like a friendship which has a shared experience. So maybe you like going to, I don't know, to the pub together,
Or football.
or a sport, or maybe a theatre
It's pleasure,
performance.
essentially, is what he's talking about. It's friendship
So the
built on
focus
pleasure.
is on that. So
But
that
as soon
would
as it
be-
becomes unpleasurable, what then? Are you prepared to fight for that friendship when actually it's not pleasurable anymore, and then it becomes fickle?
Well, I'm sure our experience would be the same. That a lot of friendships I had when I was younger, maybe at college or at university, were friendships that were based on that. So a shared experience, like going out to the pub together, or sharing in a sport together.
Yeah.
But once that I don't know, once the whistle goes on the game, you're not friends
In the same way.
Yeah. Well, at any deeper level than that. Maybe the only thing that you speak about really is the sport that you both enjoy, but you don't go beyond that.
Yeah.
So that seems to be that I can resonate with it, with that insight from Aelred on that level.
And it's not necessarily superficial, even though it's just for a particular purpose. I think Aquinas might talk about friendship of common endeavor, or a sort of common purpose. You have this particular bond with each other that revolves around this particular activity, and not really beyond. But it's not really the full, true depth of friendship.
Yeah. It's not a bad thing.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It's not that pleasure can't be part of a spiritual friendship. Actually, it should be part of a spiritual friendship, because pleasure and joy have a relationship with each other, of course. It's not that, all good and true friendships must really be built on misery and hardship and pain. Absolutely not. But
so spiritual friendship includes...
it includes
some of these things.
Some of these things, yeah. But this is also sort of friendship on a natural level as well, isn't it? Those people who you're naturally drawn to or naturally attracted to. That's what Therese would say. And Aquinas would say, you have these sort of natural things in common, and some reciprocity and some sort of equality. For Therese, you don't necessarily need equality, because God can overcome that difference in equality. And Aquinas says the same thing about our friendship with God. How can we be friends with God when there can be no possibility of equality between God and humanity? Because God and humanity are not just different in degree. They're not just different, they're different in kind. They're different sorts. God is not a thing. I was going to say sorts of things, but God is not a thing. And he would say that actually God overcomes that barrier. So then you can have this more profound spiritual friendship, which is built on virtue and Christ. Now, Aelred focuses much more on Thomas also does focus on virtue. A good true friendship is built on virtue, according to Thomas as well. But you do see this progression from the time of Augustine, who, Aelred basically baptizes Cicero through a filter of Augustine. So a lot of Cicero he takes, and then he sort of reforms it and shapes it based on what he's read in Augustine. And then after Aelred, you have Thomas, who again expands and develops this idea of friendship again. And then by the time you get to Therese, I think, universalizes it even more than Thomas. She's got that sort of boldness to go a step further.
So just on,
sorry, going back.
Just Aelred.
I'll get off my hobby horse.
So just on Aelred. So he has that first level of friendship. Then, so we might say that that's based on a form of pleasure, a shared experience.
Yeah.
And then you have his second level of friendship, which is based on like a material advantage or maybe a material possession. So this might be someone who you study with. So you're at school or university, or someone you work with, and you have that common goal of a work project that you're both working on. But once that has ended, well, the friendship doesn't go beyond that. And then there's that third level, which is the spiritual friendship. And Aelred says that this is based on Christ's new commandment to love. So this is where he brings in Christ, where he allows that to be the foundation for that spiritual friendship.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, also in terms of like that sort of economic partnership, like work friends, work friends can take on a deeper meaning. But again, it's like friends for a reason or friends for a season. They're not necessarily going to be those deep and lasting friendships which really, cor ad cor loquitur, heart speaks unto heart. They're not necessarily going to be those friendships which are founded and built on Christ, which, from my experience, brings a different level of intimacy and a different sharing of one's life. All friendships, for Aelred, for Cicero, for Aristotle, for Aquinas, for Therese of Lisieux, they all involve a sharing of one's life. You can't have a friendship whereby you're not sharing in one another's life. But how deep and how profound that goes depends on the sort of friendship, what sort of friendship it is and what foundations it's built on. And what also the end of the friendship, or what purpose it is, what's the direction? The direction for Aelred of true spiritual friendship is Jesus Christ himself. And, that's it. So in the when I say that's it, I don't mean that there is nothing else within the friendship, like pleasure, for example, or working towards other common goals together, like, I don't know, building a hospital or something, but fundamentally, it's defined by the presence of Jesus Christ. That is why it has this transcendently intimate possibility that you don't have in the same way of the others. I think it's in the Mirror of Charity even. He talks about the friendship almost like it's a third person, like it's something alive. It's not just two people in this friendship, it's three. Christ is the love between the two people, and this is why treachery and betrayal is something that's so important, so devastating, because it's almost like it's killing or suffocating something that's living, something that is alive, and this is why for Aelred you have to be really careful who you have a friendship with, a true spiritual friendship with, because it takes on a life of its own, and there's something sacred about it. And he basically says there's no real good reason to forsake a spiritual friendship. He does talk about betrayal, he does talk about treachery, but he says the reason it's so tragic is because it's like something alive has died when things like that has happened. So there's like a sort of murderous.
Yeah, I mean, he speaks about a number of things which destroy a friendship. He says slander, reproach, pride, betrayal of confidence, and detraction.
Betrayal, yeah.
So the reason why these hurt the friendship so much is because you reveal your inner self to the other person, but it's reciprocal.
So it wounds you much more deeply.
Yeah,
you see.
Yeah. I mean, because it goes straight to the interior life of the other person. But the the other point which Aelred makes is that this friendship is reciprocal, and together over time you have this mutual growth together as people. So because as he says, Christ is the principle and goal of that friendship. So Christ is the starting point, and he's also the goal of that friendship. And Christ says himself, "Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect." So in this friendship, Aelred really sees spiritual friendship as building up the other person towards perfection in that life with God.
Notice that building up, it's a process, not just an event. It's a process that is ongoing. That's really important, because very often when people think "be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect," they think, "Oh, done. Now I have to be absolutely impeccable in absolutely everything that I do." But actually, you're absolutely spot on. It's not simply an event. There are particular events within this, of course. There is a starting point, for example. That's an event. But it is also an ongoing process, just like our justification. Yeah. Sorry.
No.
It's
very important to state. And you also have, it's very interesting, you have in the lives of the saints, so many saints have friends who are saints. And this is something you see with so many of them. You think of like John Paul II, who was very close to Mother Teresa. I mean, they're both canonized saints now. They both recognize the church as saints. But they had this very close affinity with each other, very close friendship. I mean, there are loads of saints within the Dominican order as well.
Yeah, I think particularly of somebody like Blessed Jordan of Saxony, who is the immediate successor to St. Dominic, and Blessed Diana, and their letters are very intimate. When I say intimate, intimacy is, I think, fundamentally about knowing somebody else as they are and being seen and being known by them really in the depths of your soul. So I think that's really what intimacy is about. And you see that in their letters, that this profound love. I think some people would actually be quite scandalized in how they spoke about each other and how they wrote to each other, really mourning the loss of the presence of the other, and they say things like, "Oh, well, I'm with you in prayer, I'm in your heart, and I'm comforted by the knowledge of your sure and certain love for me," and things like that. Essentially, it's if somebody would come across it now in a modern context, they'd be quite shocked, because they think, "Oh my gosh, this must be a romantic love letter," because this would be how this is how we would write. Well, if we write romantic love letters to each other anymore, is another. Romantic Facebook messages, maybe.
How other people speak to each other nowadays.
But they're talking about this, and I mean, they're both faithful to their vows, right? And they both know that they're celibate, and anything other than that is incompatible with their vocation. But it doesn't stop them from loving, and the way that they talk about this profound spiritual friendship that they have, where they feel like the other person is like an extension of themselves, which is exactly what Aelred describes on spiritual friendship, that the other person and you essentially become like co-parents, almost like co-guardians. He calls it guardians of the friendship. That you both have this duty to protect it, because it's like an extension of yourself. And you see that in the writings of Blessed Jordan and Diana. I think Catherine of Siena. There was I forget if it's Raymond of Penafort or I think it's Reginald of Orleans, but I forget which. There was also a very close friendship there. You find others.
But the point is that God, we don't just have an isolated relationship with God. God sees it as fitting to bring his love to us through friends, to help us grow in our relationship with him through friends, and that God sees that as a fitting way. And you see this across the church. You see it with the communion of saints, that you have God provides the saints for us. He provides the
Absolutely.
community of the church.
And he commands it. He said, yes, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your strength. But the second is like the first, love your neighbor as yourself. And as Jesus says, at the Last Supper, love one another as I have loved you. You're commanded to love your neighbor. It's not simply love for God alone. God commands you to love your neighbor. And as Therese says, well, if we're called to love one another as he has loved us, and he says, I call you no longer servants, but friends, and friendship is love, then we are called to love each other as friends.
Aelred says something on spiritual friendship. But another quote here. He says, one can make a rather easy transition from human friendships to friendship with God himself. And I think that's very important. So for Aelred, he sees friendship as pointing to the inner life of God. So in the Trinity, there are three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and they share this mutual bond of love. And friendships that we experience here on earth are a taste or an insight into that love which is in the Trinity. And this is something which is given to us as a great gift to help us to enter more deeply into that love of God which is found in the Trinity.
Yeah, I think the love it's very interesting. Somebody like Aquinas, for example, he says like St. John, that God is charity. And then later in another question, he says that charity is friendship. But he doesn't go as far as to say that God is friendship. And I was talking to Father Michael Sherwin, who has just become the director of the Institute for Spirituality at the Angelicum. And he was saying it's because, the relationships between the divine persons in the Trinity are deeper than friendship, but that we can have friendship with God. And Aquinas talks about how we have friendship with God, but we're also adopted sons and daughters of God. So it's interesting how you have multiple ways of talking about this relationship that we're entering into.
Yeah. But I suppose the main point there is that the friendships we have, spiritual friendships we
reflect
have here on this
God's
earth,
love.
Yeah, but also that they're a gift from God to us, to help us to see something of God's love. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So with the importance of spiritual friendship in mind, it's so important to be discerning about who your friends are, to seek out this beautiful spiritual friendship. I thought you were
going to... You can see that I've got this... what first came into my mind when you said to seek out, the first thing that came to my mind was to seek out new life and new civilizations, to boldly go where no one has gone before. Which is, it's the beginning of Star Trek: The Next Generation.
I don't know.
Dan's not a Star Trek fan. But as you said, to seek out, I was like, new life and new civilizations, to boldly go where no one's gone before.
I'm afraid I don't know Star Trek or Star Wars, or I'm not.
Oh yeah, because they're all the same to you, Dan.
Yeah, are they not?
Lord.
Yeah. But seek out these friendships that encourage you toward the good. Anyway, so I draw our episode to a close. Thanks for joining us for this episode. If it's been helpful, please share it with other people and like the video. It helps the video to reach more people, and be sure to subscribe.
Since we said video, for the people who are not on YouTube, we should tell you that we're now on YouTube. So we will say video, but it doesn't mean that we're giving up on our audio content. It just means that the audio from the YouTube video will be put on Podbean, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, other platforms, Yeah.
So thanks for joining us.
God bless.
God bless. Bye.